My name is Dorothy Nelson, and I grew up in San Pedro, California. But when I was in the second grade, we moved to the heart of Los Angeles, where I ended up going to the same high school my mother had gone to when she was a child, had the same Latin teacher. My father was a building contractor, but he was a great lover of the out of doors, and we had, next to our big old-fashioned house in the heart of Los Angeles, had an acre of land that was an open lot, and I grew up learning to love to grow flowers and vegetables, outdoor things. In fact, I can remember my mother boiling the water before we'd pick the corn, and we'd run in the house to throw the corn into the water. That we also had animals that we loved. I was a great lover of dogs, not cats. I'm sorry to say, my daughter is a great lover of cats. But the dogs, the gardening, and my father, I understood later when I had children, we had a badminton court, an archery range, a barbecue. My parents loved to have everything at our house. And I now realize they knew where we were, they knew who we were with, and so forth. My mother, the teacher, taught English, everything from junior high to junior college. In fact, she was still teaching at Harvard Junior College when she was in her 80s. And I'm in my 80s now, and I never thought I'd be working in my 80s, but I could understand the energy she got from that. Well, my growing up period was very interesting because my older sister was very creative, still writes children's stories, became a teacher. My mother was a teacher, my aunt was a teacher. It looked as if I was going to be a teacher growing up. The only problem was I was incredibly shy. And I would speak when I was spoken to. You'd never believe it now. But my mother enrolled me in a tap dancing and a ballet class that I loved and excelled. And all of a sudden, I began speaking up, talking to people. And so when I was in the fourth grade in this very progressive school where we got to grade our own papers and create art and poetry and so forth, and I got to be the teacher for the day, I found that I really enjoyed it. I had a perfectly behaved class. Everybody loved it. And I think that's sort of my like of being in charge. Although later in my life, when my husband and I were at events and I would say, "What about this?" he'd always turn to me and say, "Sweetheart, you're not in charge." And I had to learn that as well. But growing up, our family loved camping. We loved the beach. And we had a beach house in Seal Beach. And during the Depression, we had to move into that beach house when my father lost everything. They were some of the happiest days of our lives. We had an outdoor playhouse that we had to sleep in because of the danger of earthquakes. But it was a wonderful community effort. And I can remember my mother conducting ballroom classes. I was for the whole community, so that bringing them together. I thought we'd have balls in the ballroom, but we didn't. We did learn to dance. But when I got married to my husband, Jim, an only child, and when after the dinner at our home, someone would put on music and everybody would get up and dance, he would just sort of look around until I'd pull him up and say, "This is what our family does." Or when my sisters and I would do the dishes, the ping pong table would come out, and my mother didn't trust anybody who could beat her at ping pong. She was a ping pong aficionado. So we had a sort of a crazy family life in our big old fashioned house. We would be eating dinner, and this is a big surprise to my husband. In would come some neighbors, and they would set up a card table and begin to play cards. And then when we were through with dinner, my father would go and play cards. But if the neighbors didn't come in and set up the card table, uh, one of us, one of my sisters, right, would have to play cards until the neighbors came. And people kept saying, did your parents look over you when you did homework all the time? I said, no, I had a horrible time saying, I've got to study, I've got to study. Just one-handed bridge, just one-handed pinochle. But it was sort of like a crazy family. But my father, with our badminton court, our archery range, my older sister was non-athletic. So my father built this archery range, saying she didn't have to run around, she didn't have to do exercises. She became an expert archer. My younger sister and I were very athletically inclined and did everything. We became ping pong experts, which later, when I was in law school, and Dean Roscoe Pound, the former dean of the Harvard Law School, was at UCLA as our dean emeritus, he bought a ping pong table for the law school. And he said, ping pong is the best exercise for your eyes. It's a shame that you didn't all grow up with a ping pong table. And I said, I grew up with a ping pong table and had many fun times in law school with that. But basically, my childhood was very happy. I loved dancing, I loved swimming, I loved the activities of our family, except my father, being a building contractor, had grown up with the obvious prejudices of a Midwesterner. He was born in Nebraska, with people of other races or other religions. And he and his subcontractors would often make what I would consider to be unfortunate remarks about people of other races or religions. My mother, on the other hand, was ultra, as he called her, liberal. And she wrote columns about the United Nations for various publications, and she encouraged us to have friends of all backgrounds and races. And I remember when my uncle, who'd been brought up like my father, came to my third grade birthday party, he turned to my mother and said, how come Dorothy has so many Jewish friends? And I asked her, my mother, afterward, what is a Jew? Well, she then explained to me. So I was brought in this sort of tension-filled with respect to race and religion. We were high Episcopalians. We went to Sunday school. I had gold stars. What I really realized later, when I became a Baha'i, my husband, who had been a junior minister at the Beverly Vista Presbyterian Church, knew the Old and New Testament backwards and forwards, chapters and verse. Well, I knew the stories about Jesus, but I couldn't do chapter and verse. And so at Sunday school, when I was about 11 years old, our wonderful minister invited a group of black youth to come to our youth meeting on Sunday night. We played volleyball, we had refreshments, had a wonderful time. When I came home and explained what we'd just done, my father was appalled. My mother was just fine with it. But I had this feeling there's something wrong here. Also, when I was confirmed in the Episcopal Church at age 13, I remember looking up at Bishop Gooden and said, why are we, the Christians, the ones to be saved? What about the Buddhists? What about the Hindus? What about the the Jews and the Muslims? He looked at me and said, young lady, you will understand when you grow up. And so when I ultimately became a Baha'i, I thought back on that conversation, and Bishop Gooden had moved on to the spiritual worlds by then, thinking, Bishop Gooden, I now understand what it is. They're all one religion of God. But my father loved not only gardening and gave us a great love for animals, but he took us fishing. And I must say, when we go fishing with my father, it's usually ocean fishing and rarely catch anything. When I was first married and my husband and I went on our honeymoon to Mammoth Lakes, and I said, don't buy a fishing license for me. You go fishing, I'll go hiking. Come with me once, he said, and we went out on the lake, Twin Lakes at Mammoth, went fishing and caught our limit in 1 hour. Next morning I said, get up, we're going fishing. So I loved fishing with my father, just to be with my father, and it was fun. We'd get in this old truck and go down to the beach. We dug for scallops, we had lobster traps, we lived off the land. And in fact, during the Depression, when my father lost everything, he and several other men would go out every other day catching loads of fish to bring in for the whole Seal Beach community and basically fed them. His garden had enough vegetables to feed everybody in town. It was a very small town then. We had to eat outside because of the danger of fire and earthquakes. But that kind of service to the community sort of defined my dad for me as something very good and something that made other people happy. And I think that I was terribly influenced by that all my life, trying to look to my right and to my left, what do we need? And that was influenced by my family. My younger sister was the super athlete and skier, swimmer, diver, and so forth. And later in my life, she died at the age of 32 and had 3 children who ended up spending most of their time with us. So we ended up with 4 little girls and 1 boy. When I say we, let me tell you about my husband. In the 11th grade, my older sister was a YMCA counselor and met her husband-to-be there. My husband-to-be, Jim, became a YMCA counselor, and then I got a job with the Culver Palmas YMCA with all of them. They preceded me, and I was a swimming director. Well, until that time, I began looking around society, and I had a boys' club of 18 little 8-year-olds called the Gorillas. They named themselves. My husband had a boys' club of 18 little 8-year-olds called the Cherokees. Well, we used to go on field trips, and I took my gorillas down to the Santa Monica Pier to go fishing, and all of a sudden little Herbie next to me said, Dorothy, Dorothy, the Cherokees are coming. In those days it was appropriate to wear feathers, and did they come and sit with us? No, they sat on the other side of the pier. The next Saturday I took my gorillas up to the planetarium. And there was a 1-mile hike up to the planetarium in Ferndale. As we were going on this hike, little Herbie, always at my side, said, Dorothy, Dorothy, the Cherokees are coming. And there the little feathers were coming up. This time, I waited. And they got to the top. And Jim, my husband-to-be, said, why don't we take our field trips together? I said, that sounds wonderful, because I always thought he was somebody who loved children, he was a wonderful administrator, etc. Well, my gorillas came from underprivileged families. And I go to their homes, they needed health care, they needed food, they needed money. And I would go and to find the proper person to help them. And they kept saying, the law says this, the law says that. Because I thought, after being with the gorillas, I really wanted to be a social worker so I could help people. But the more I tried to help them, the more I found there were laws out there that said I couldn't. So I said, I think I'll go to law school. And it was really at that point in my life, I went to law school because I wanted to change things. I wanted to make them better. And what happened was, Jim went off to Stanford, I was at UCLA. He then transferred to UCLA to be where I was. He was going to go to medical school and was accepted at Stanford Medical School. But we've been going together for some time. And I went to take the law school exam. He'd already taken the medical exam and was accepted at Stanford Medical School. Well, when we took the exam together, the first half was identical to the medical exam. I never sat next to Jim taking an exam again. He flipped through it. I was sitting there trying to figure it out. Well, he got notice from Stanford that he needed a $2,000 microscope. He needed about $5,000 or $6,000 worth of things. He said he did so well on the law exam, let's both go to law school and then you put me through medical school. Well, we ended up both going to law school. He went to one law school, Loyola, because they permitted you to work in the afternoon. UCLA, we went from 8 until 6, and we even went to school on Saturdays, just so you could work. So we did not want to impose on our parents to take care of our education. Well, while in law school, there were 72 in my class at UCLA. It was the second class in the law school. 2 women, 1 black. We were all invited to join a legal fraternity, Phi Delta Phi. We all joined, and then 6 weeks later, the National wrote and said, this is 1950, before Brown versus Board of Education, before desegregation. Sorry, no women, no blacks. The president of my law school class, a former fraternity brother of my husband's, very bright, but I didn't think he had a serious thought in his head, called our whole class together. He said, this is outrageous. Let's all resign and form the UCLA Law Society. Everybody resigned, and I went up to Donald and said, Donald, that was really a very nice thing to do, but I really said, whatever led you to do it? He said, I've been going to Baha'i meetings in Westwood Village. And I said, oh, that must be Buddhist. I said, no, no, no. Then it must be Hindu. No, 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 no. It's an independent world religion teaching the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of mankind. The equality of women and men, and the abolition of prejudice of all kinds. Would you like to come to a meeting? I said, oh, Donald, that's so nice, but I'm very active in my own church. And, you know, Jim is really a junior minister in the Beverly Vista Presbyterian Church. But thank you anyway. Well, Donald was not yet a Baha'i, because he did a very sneaky thing. He and his wife had us to a steak dinner to play bridge. Well, we were starving law students living on hot dogs and macaroni and cheese. So with this wonderful steak dinner, as he began to pass out the cards, he said, say, there's a Baha'i fireside going on just 2 or 3 blocks away. Would you like to go? He had told us that a fireside was where there's no clergy, but you would learn something about the faith. Well, I looked at my husband and he looked at me, and I said, well, that would be very interesting. As my husband and I went to our car, he turns to me and says, let's sit close to the door in case it's weird. Well, it obviously wasn't weird. And what was interesting about that, as I say, we would try to go to firesides. We were sort of taken, and we would come up with our yellow pads and say, what about this, this, and this? And I think we went to the home of people who gave firesides for many decades, Lois and Maury Willows. I think they wanted to pull the blinds down when they saw us coming, because I'd sit up in the front row and Jim would sit up in the front and what about this? What about that? Pretty soon, when questions were asked, we began answering the questions for the questioner. And we began talking about nothing but the faith to our friends. And it really took us longer than it should have, but with the combination, after we got out of law school, that's when we became Baha'is, the very next year. But Donald became a Baha'i our second year of law school. When he talked about issues of race, mind you, we still had segregation, when he talked about issues of equality, he was a very good student, but not number one in the class. You could hear a pin drop in the room. The force behind what he was saying, it wasn't, this is what we ought to do. It was, this is what is prescribed for us to do. In the next 10 years, out of my class of 72, 17 and their families became Baha'is. It all started with that one righteous act of speaking up what one believed to be the truth. So, needless to say, becoming Baha'i had a profound influence on our life. And my great-grandfather had been a minister of the Church of England, and the whole family was very suspicious. Was it a cult? What was it? The loveliest thing had happened. Jim and I got married at UCLA before we were Baha'is, because I'd been a student body vice president. All our friends were there. It was a very large wedding in St. Albans Episcopal Church. When Reverend Stewart, the Presbyterian minister of Jim, walked in, the woman in charge of weddings said, "But he can't come behind the altar rail." Whereupon my minister said, "Reverend Stewart, be my guest. But he can't do the marriage vows." Whereupon my minister said to Reverend Stewart, "We'd be happy to have you do the marriage vows." Driving home from that rehearsal, Jim and I were just saying to each other, isn't this ridiculous? We both believe in God. We believe our purpose here is to know and love God and to make this world better, and to have all these little things going on. Well, the lovely thing was, Reverend Stewart, Jim's minister, the Presbyterian, was sent around the world when he retired. And he went to Haifa. And Jim and I called our friends in Haifa and said, "Please, I hope you can give them some special attention." Well, we had some very good friends in Haifa at that time. Harriet, the Wolcotts, who had helped deepen us in the faith. And they really showed hospitality to the Stewarts. When the Stewarts came home from their round-the-world trip, they got off the plane at LAX and went right to Jim's parents' house and said, "It's okay, it's a real religion." And from that time on, Jim's parents relaxed, because they were the most uptight of all. My mother was, "Why can't I just be a good Christian?" And I say, "But Mother, Christ said, 'I have many things to say unto you, but you cannot bear them now. Howbeit when he, the Spirit of truth, is come, he will lead you unto all truth.'" And that's Baha'u'llah. Oh, well, Jim's mother, on the other hand, when his father died in Orange County, at a place then called Leisure World, I called the Presbyterian Church and said, my mother-in-law would like her son to participate in the memorial service. In fact, she would like him to help conduct it. "Are you Presbyterians?" I said, "No, he was a Presbyterian, but he has become a Baha'i. I'll call you back." Called us back and said he could give a prayer at the end, but that's all. Jim's mother, whom we had taken to Baha'i summer school, Bosch, with her sister, who became a Baha'i at Bosch, Jim's mother had not yet become a Baha'i, said, "Then I want a Baha'i service. I want my grandchildren to say Baha'i prayers. I want Jimmy, my son, to conduct it." So at Leisure World, in their recreation room, we had several hundred people and had a Baha'i ceremony. She had to come live with us because she had congestive heart failure. So we've had firesides at our home since 1961. We were sort of emulating the Willows. If they could do it, we could do it. And we loved the firesides, as a matter of fact, although when our children were small, it was uh, quite something to get the homework done and get everybody fed into bed. Jim's mother would come to the firesides. At the very first fireside when she came to live with us, I brought home cookies I had bought at the store. And she said, "Dear, don't you make your own cookies for your guests?" And I said, "Grandma, I'm working. I'm teaching full time. I have to take care of the children." Next Wednesday, she made 5 dozen chocolate chip, 5 dozen oatmeal raisin, and people still come to our house. Grandma died a few years ago looking for Grandma's cookies. But one day, Grandma was in the room during the fireside, and my husband was speaking about progressive revelation. She interrupted him. She said, Jimmy, I get this. Baha'u'llah is my Jesus." And Jim said, "Yes, Mother, you're absolutely right." And she became a Baha'i that night, which was 1981, and she lived to be almost 90. Well, the lovely thing about that was, living with us that one whole year, she kept wanting to contribute to the Baha'i faith. I was national treasurer, and I said, "Grandma, only Baha'is can contribute to the faith. Unless it's for a big social economic project that is for the world, only Baha'is can contribute to the faith." She stopped the fireside. She said, "I want to go in the kitchen with my daughter-in-law, the national treasurer. I want to write a check to the Baha'i faith for my very first time." That had stuck with her, that only Baha'is could contribute to the faith. And growing up in a Christian church, of course, the plate is passed at every kind of service, and that was very impressive to her. What was nice about Grandma becoming a Baha'i, it was nice for our children. Because when my parents were alive and Jim's parents were alive, Christmas was the big thing. And so we went and celebrated Christmas Eve with one, Christmas with the other, and our children had the Christmas tree and all the gifts. But when we were all Baha'is, we began making wonderful celebrations during the Baha'i holidays, the intercalary days, the gift-giving days, during the fast, just before the fast, and then the Baha'i New Year. So it helped a lot. Well, I started to tell you about my younger sister, Nancy. She and her husband, by this time, when her children, my children were 4 and 6. It was before my sister died. And hers were 3, 5, and 7. We did everything together. When they come to our house, we'd find the minute we talk about the Baha'i faith, they'd stop talking. So I said to my husband, "You know what? Let's not talk about the Baha'i faith. Let's wait till they ask." Well, a year went by. One night, my younger sister called me up. "Dorothy, Hugh," her husband, "and I want to come to your fireside tonight. Is it okay?" And I had to keep from leaping through the phone. And I said, "Oh, we would love to have you. I'll tell you what, get a babysitter for the kids, and we'll go out to dinner." Well, my sister loved to go out to dinner. So we went out to dinner and came back. Again, my husband was speaking, right in the middle of the fireside. My dramatic younger sister stood up and said, "I believe in Baha'u'llah." And I said, "Calm down, Nancy. I'm thrilled." And Jim said, "That's wonderful. We'll talk to you at the break." So I go up to her and say, "Here, we've given you books of the past, but I suspect you haven't really looked at them, have you?" What they had done, they'd been going to firesides for that 1 year in Whittier, 30 miles from us, where they lived, not telling us, because they didn't want us to influence them in making the choice. So then my younger sister became a Baha'i. Her children, my children, all went to Baha'i summer school together. We had Baha'i Sunday school together. And so it was a very happy thing when you have a family all believing in the same thing. My younger sister and her husband were particularly good with youth. As I say, my younger sister was the dramatic one. She'd have them do arts and singing and crazy things. People were more inclined to go by the book. Well, that was not my sister. Well, she was terribly attracted to Hands of the Cause. And since Jim and I, Hands of the Cause, being great teachers in the faith, were on the National Spiritual Assembly, we were privileged to be with Hands of the Cause like William Sears, Mr. Fazey, and so forth, quite a bit of the time. So when we would go to a meeting, I remember in Beverly Hills once, with my sister and her husband, my sister, I want to sit at the front row. I want to be near Mr. Fazey. And I sort of, all right, you go right ahead, sit at the front row. Well, the interesting thing was, it was sort of a mystical thing that happened in her life. Mr. Fazey came in, and before he spoke, he went right to my sister, embraced her, and said, "You have a great future in this faith." Well, of course, she was just in seventh heaven. Later, Mr. and Mrs. Sears, who used to spend a good deal of time at our house, called Nancy and Hugh, and they lived in a little tract house, 3 bedrooms with 3 kids. "We'd like to spend the weekend with you. Could you give us a weekend? You're free." And she called me, "What'll I do? Hand of the Cause." I said, "Put your 3 girls all in 1 bedroom. You give them a bedroom, and you will love it." The Sears visited them 2 weekends in that year. Well, my sister had been a high diver, and at the Ambassador Auditorium, where Bobby Kennedy was killed, she went off the high board, and no one saw this man going under the board, and she cracked her head, the right side of her head. That's when she was 22. When she was 32, she began to get headaches. And she was at our house on New Year's Day. We had a big dinner, watched football, and then she fell asleep on the couch. And I said, "That's my sister. She hates to do dishes." But she woke up and said, "You know, I dreamed that I died." And I said, "Nancy, you had too much to eat. You know, go home and rest." 6 weeks later, she was diagnosed with a brain tumor and told that she would have only a few weeks to live. Well, in her dream, she dreamed that she saw the light at the end of the tunnel and that Baha'u'llah was there. She said, "I can't die now. I need 2 years to get my children accustomed to the fact that I won't be with them on the material world." Well, she was diagnosed with the brain tumor. She had 3 operations. Each time, one of her doctors became a Baha'i. Nurses became Baha'is. After the operation, she'd be fine for a while. They could not get the whole tumor because it was too attached to her brain. The year she died, she was in the hospital in a coma for 10 days. And Mr. Fazey and Mr. Sears were both in town. They came to see her. She, as I say, had been in a coma for 10 days. Mr. Sears said the tablet of Ahmad. Mr. Fazey chanted the tablet of Ahmad. She woke up out of her coma and said, "Bill," as she called him, "Fazey," and she died with a smile on her face. Well, that had a profound influence. She had a kind of mystical connection, I think some Baha'is do. And I'll never forget, we had a memorial service, and at the reception, I worked with the 3 little girls, and we baked cookies and so forth. And Julie, the oldest girl, was 9, and she passed out cookies to a woman, and the woman said, "Why aren't you crying? Your mother is dead." She said, "My mother is in the spiritual worlds of God, and she doesn't have any more pain. Have a cookie." And she left, and she came in and just gave me a big hug. So those girls became a big part of our life as we were progressing, and it affected, when I was teaching at USC, 5 hours in the law school is a total load. So I'd only go in 3 days a week, 11 and 2, always trying to be home when the girls were there. But since we knew my sister was going to die, she and her husband moved close to us. My older sister moved across the street. So when my sister died, the children didn't have to change schools. They didn't have to change Girl Scouts. They didn't have to change dancing lessons and so forth. And the Baha'i community just surrounded them with such love. Mr. Fazey, until he died, every month sent them a letter. I don't know how he did it. And often would insert a piece of a robe of Abdu'l-Baha, or some very special thing. I have it in a box in my attic, Mr. Fazey. The fact that we were Baha'is made such a huge difference. And the fact that my husband was a Baha'i, and my very best friend, the most outstanding man I have ever known, he was so wonderful with the children. And when I was elected to the National Assembly, I said, "I can't do it, I can't." I came home and Jim said, "You're elected. You've got to do it." And the strange thing was, the children all say, "When are you going to Wilmette again?" Because he would plan special weekends whenever I was away. They couldn't wait till I was away, where I would be coming home with the airplane, tears streaming down. So it was Jim that made the difference. Now, when I became a Baha'i, many people said, "Oh, be very bad, you're a lawyer." And I was working at USC as a research associate, and then the dean called me in one day and said, a professor who happened to be the vice president of the university, is going to Europe. I was taking his course, which was really awful because it was anecdotal, and it was a course in law reform. Would you take over the course for the rest of the semester? Because I'd been working for 3 years on this book with this professor. I said, "Oh, I would love to." So when I took over the course, one of the things I added was based on my Baha'i background: consultation, the way to resolve conflict. And in law school, I just hated the adversary system. It was too costly, too painful, too destructive, too inefficient, in my mind, for a civilized society. And the Baha'i concept of consultation, where people come together and resolve their own disputes, just sounded wonderful. So I called it mediation, because consultation is a very high form of mediation. I go to my first faculty meeting. I'm the only woman on the faculty because I taught that course and then was asked to stay on and become a full-time member of the faculty. Someone said, "What is Dorothy teaching?" "Mediation. That's not law." And the answer was, "Oh, she's just trying to make people love each other." Well, it gives me such pleasure today to say mediation is the hottest topic in the justice system today, and is spreading like wildfire, and has been in existence in many countries in various forms. And as a result, you know, this is why I have ended up in China, in India, in Africa, all over the place, Pakistan. I have a picture it's right over in my office, where I conducted for some Pakistani lawyers, some Sri Lankan lawyers, some Filipino lawyers, and Indian lawyers on the use of mediation to resolve conflict. When they drew the border between India and Pakistan, they did it very quickly. So there were all sorts of disputes along the border. Who owns the 200-year-old fish pond? Who gets to hunt in the forest? And so I went to Islamabad with a wonderful mediator from UCLA to help train these judges that this was a good way to resolve conflict peacefully. The interesting thing was, this wonderful mediator who knew far more about mediation, when the judges would ask a question, they didn't want him to answer, they wanted the judge to answer. At any rate, we set up mediation teams all along the border. Well, they had to meet in homes, and we had Hindus, we had Buddhists, we had Muslims, we had atheists, but they met in each other's homes, one side of the border. Custom on both sides was to serve sweets. The children will play in the yard. And we resolved conflicts. I say we, I wasn't it. Conflicts were resolved in over 85% of the cases. They would either share the fish pond, or they would say, you do it this week, we get it next week. Same with the forest. They'd either share shooting in the forest, but usually you could do it this week, we'll do it that week. But they ended up becoming friends. When your children play with each other, when you have tea and sweets with somebody, you see they're human beings, they have the same concerns. They love their families. They want education and health for their families and so forth. In that period of time, it was just so wonderful to see what can happen when people come together and listen to each other and listen to each other's hearts, that they become friends. And the whole Baha'i concept of the oneness of humanity, you can just see it around the corner if you can get rid of all the super partisan politics going on, that people can be brought together. Well, at any rate, I got into this because I was a Baha'i. And all of my friends had told me, when I was offered the job at USC for $250 a month, as opposed to 1950s, a law firm of $350 a month, my dear husband said, even though we're paying off our law school debts, you do what you want to do. And I said, I know what I want to do. I want to teach, and I want other young lawyers to see that there are various ways to help resolve disputes. So they said, well, you could never advance, in the university like this and so forth. And when I became dean of the law school, some of my friends who'd gone with big law firms, working 60-hour weeks, not having children, all to be like what the men were doing. And the men were often very unhappy with their own lives anyway. The faith really influenced my life in a very, very profound way. Other things that happened when I was dean of the law school, I became head of the Great Issues Forum on campus. And as a result, we had brought many, many wonderful speakers to campus, including, and I remember particularly, John F. Kennedy. And as I hosted him, I never missed an opportunity to mention the faith, of course, knowing the good Catholic that he was. What surprised me about both John Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy was they knew about the faith and were very complimentary about what Baha'is were attempting to accomplish in the world, even good Catholics that they were. But when the Universal House of Justice put out the promise of world peace, and Jim and I were asked to deliver it to all the members of the Supreme Court, a Baha'i, Rick Shickley, was general counsel for the Supreme Court. And he said, okay, you can come, only 5 minutes, no pictures, please don't overstay your welcome. Well, Jim and I walk into the chambers of Chief Justice Berger. He said, welcome, come and sit down. This is one of the most interesting documents I've ever read. Let's have tea and cookies. Rick is walking back and forth. Why are they in there so long? We obviously were in there longer. We ended up missing our plane. We walk into Justice Seaver's chambers. Oh, I'm so happy to see you. My first secretary was a Baha'i. Come, sit, let's have tea. We had tea. This again. We go into Thurgood Marshall, who was one of my dearest friends all throughout my life, and that dealt with issues of race in the law school. He was a tremendous help there. His wife, Sissy, went to Baha'i school in Hawaii when she was a young girl. So we walk into Justice Thurgood Marshall's, and a great big man gives you a bear hug, which you can barely breathe. Before you talk to me about your Baha'i stuff, he said, I want you to promise me to go to my Episcopal church and tell them to let women be priests. I said, Mr. Justice Marshall, I wouldn't dream of telling your elders what to do. Why don't you have Sissy do it if you want someone to do it? Well, instead of spending a total of 45 minutes, we were with the Supreme Court justices for 3.5 hours by the time we got. But had I not been a Baha'i, I would never have had that experience. And it was one of the happiest experiences of my life.